Hello, this is Jared Niemi with a mini lecture on the difference between a randomized experiment and an observational study. Alright, so to talk about these we need to define a couple of terms first. The first is going to be the general idea of an experimental unit. And actually in statistics there are a number of different types of units, in particular experimental units, sampling units, and units of observation, at least those as a minimum. For the purpose of getting a basic introduction into this idea of randomized experiments versus observational studies, we're going to actually just treat these as if they're all the same, and in many cases, in many studies, they are actually all the same, but they can be different. And as we move forward, we're going to be talking about them just as an experimental unit. Alright, so what is an experimental unit? Well, this is basically just one member of some group that's being studied. Alright, so it might be helpful to have a couple of examples. So we might be running an experiment where we're looking at a number of soybean plants and something about those plants, and so each particular plant will be one experimental unit. Alternatively, our study might be designed to look at an agricultural plot, which maybe has many soybean plants, but the experimental unit that's under consideration is the whole plot itself. And then another example that comes up commonly in animal studies is that of looking at the experimental unit being a pen of a number of pigs within that pen. Alright, so that's sort of the idea of the experimental unit. That is, it's one member of some group, some population that's being studied. Then we have another definition for a treatment. So a treatment is something that researchers assign to an experimental unit. Alright, so using these previous examples, let's think about some treatments here. So a researcher might decide on a certain level of a pesticide to give to each individual soybean plant in that plant experiment. Alternatively, if we are looking at an agricultural plot, they might try different types of fertilizer on different plots. With the pen of pigs example, it is common that all pigs within a pen get the same diet, but we could randomly assign what diet the pigs in that pen are going to receive. Alright, so those are the two basic definitions we need, experimental units and treatments. So then the question is, alright, well what's an experiment, what's a randomized experiment, and what's an observational study? So an experiment, this is the definition given in Wikipedia, is an orderly procedure carried out with the goal of verifying, refuting, or establishing the validity of a hypothesis. So I like this definition because it gets at the scientific method. That is, we generate hypotheses and we try to test those hypotheses through experiments. In terms of the terminology that I've introduced so far, the key part is that an experiment is determined by the fact that a researcher gets to assign the treatment to the experimental unit. So that's what really makes an experiment. And to make a randomized experiment, that treatment allocation to experimental units needs to be done using some randomization mechanism. So two common examples are to use a random number table or to use a random number generator. As just quick examples of these, here's a random number table. You can find these in textbooks. But more commonly these days people use a random number generator. This happens to be a random number generator in R for assigning, let's say, treatments A and B to 10 units in the population. In this case, the first one got treatment B, then A, then a whole bunch of Bs, then a few As. Alright, and so this treatment allocation was done randomly through this random number generator in R. So then what is an observational study? Well, an observational study is basically the opposite. It's a situation where the researcher has no control over the assignment of treatments to experimental units. So this is common in big surveys. So here's a couple of examples: the National Agricultural Workers Survey, or for those who might know, something called the China Study. The official name is the China Cornell Oxford Project. This is looking at diet in Chinese culture. Alright, so what's the big deal about a randomized experiment versus observational study? Why should I care about whether our data were collected via an experiment or just via a study? Well, here's the big deal. The big deal is that if you're interested in making causal statements about this treatment causing some response that you see, as a general rule, you can only do this if you have a randomized experiment. Not just an experiment, but a randomized experiment. Thanks.